Picture this, you're walking through the streets of medieval Venice in 1380. The smell of spices fills the air, merchants are shouting prices, and then you turn a corner and see something that will shock you. Right next to a stall selling goats and chickens, there's a platform where human beings are being sold like livestock. Their prices are written on wooden signs hanging around their necks. Some cost less than a good horse. Most people think slavery ended when the Roman Empire fell. That's completely wrong. The medieval period, what we call the Middle Ages, was actually one of the biggest slave trading eras in European history. We're talking about a business so massive it shaped entire economies, funded crusades, and built some of the richest cities in the world. But here's what's really crazy. These weren't just random raids or small-time criminals. This was organized, international business. Venice and Genoa, two of Europe's most powerful cities, built their entire wealth on shipping humans across the Mediterranean. Vikings weren't just warriors, they were some of the biggest slave dealers in history. And the church? They had rules about it, but those rules were complicated. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a business more brutal than anything Hollywood could imagine operated right in the heart of what we call civilized Europe. And I'm going to show you something that will blow your mind, evidence that some of these trading networks were so sophisticated they make modern human trafficking look primitive. But first, let me tell you about the day I realized everything I thought I knew about medieval Europe was wrong. Number 1. Slavery never ended after Rome. I used to think like most people do. Rome falls in 476 AD, slavery disappears, feudalism takes over, everyone becomes either a knight or a peasant. Simple story, right? Then I started reading actual medieval records, not the sanitized textbook versions. Here's what really happened. When Rome collapsed, it didn't take slavery with it. Instead, slavery just changed its business model. The Romans had massive slave estates called latifundia. Think plantation-style agriculture, with thousands of slaves working the fields. When that system broke down, slavery didn't disappear, it got redistributed. Instead of huge state-owned operations, you got thousands of smaller slave owners scattered across Europe. But here's where it gets interesting. The collapse of Roman law actually made slavery worse in some ways. Under Roman law, slaves had certain protections. Not many, but some. They couldn't be killed randomly. They had legal procedures for buying freedom. They could own property in some cases. Medieval Europe, those protections were gone. A slave was literally just property, like a cow or a plow. No rights, no protections, no hope of legal freedom in most cases. And the demand was huge, way bigger than most people realize. Think about medieval Europe's economy. You've got constant warfare between kingdoms. Every war creates prisoners, and prisoners become slaves. You've got massive construction projects, cathedrals, castles, city walls. Who do you think built those? Paid workers? No way. Slave labor was cheaper, and you didn't have to worry about them quitting or going on strike. Plus, Europe was expanding. The Crusades weren't just religious wars, they were economic opportunities. Christian armies would capture entire cities and sell the population into slavery. It was so common that military commanders factored slave sales into their war budgets. But the real proof that slavery never ended is in the records. And not just a few scattered documents. We're talking about thousands of slave sale contracts, tax records, ship manifests, and court cases. All from the supposedly slavery-free medieval period. In 1086, the Doomsday Book, basically a census of England ordered by William the Conqueror, recorded about 28,000 slaves. That's just in England, just the ones important enough to count for tax purposes. Historians estimate the real number was probably 3 times higher. In medieval Ireland, slaves were so common they were used as currency. Legal documents talk about fines being paid in cumals, female slaves. 3 cumals for killing someone's cattle. 7 cumals for burning down a church. Human beings used like coins. The Frankish kingdoms, what will become France and Germany, had slave markets in every major city. Paris, Rouen, Verdun, Cologne. These weren't hidden back alley operations. They were right in the city centers, next to the regular markets, protected by local laws and taxed by local governments. And here's something that really drives the point home. When Christian missionaries went to convert pagan tribes in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, one of their biggest selling points wasn't just salvation in the afterlife. It was protection from slave raids in this life. convert to Christianity, and theoretically other Christians weren't supposed to enslave you. The word slave itself comes from Slav, the ethnic group from Eastern Europe. That's not a coincidence. So many Slavic people were enslaved during the medieval period that their ethnic name became the word for human property. But if slavery was so common, why don't we learn about it in school? Why do most people think medieval Europe was just knights and peasants? The answer is complicated, and it has a lot to do with how the story gets told. Medieval chroniclers, the people writing the histories, were usually church officials or court scribes. They wrote about kings and battles and religious ceremonies. They didn't write much about markets and trade, especially not the ugly parts of trade. Also, and this is important, many medieval slave owners didn't call their slaves slaves. They used euphemisms. Servants, bondsmen, dependents. It sounds nicer, but the reality was the same human beings owned as property. So when modern historians read these old documents, sometimes they take the euphemisms at face value. They see servant and think employee, but when you dig deeper, when you look at how these servants could be bought and sold, how their children automatically belong to the owner, how they could be punished or killed without legal consequences, it becomes clear what they really were. The truth is, slavery didn't end when Rome fell. It evolved. It adapted. It found new markets and new methods. And in some ways, medieval slavery was actually more brutal and dehumanizing than Roman slavery had ever been. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so slavery continued. But it was probably just domestic servants, right? People working in houses and small farms. Oh, you have no idea. The scale of medieval slave trading was industrial. We're talking about human beings shipped in cargo holds like wheat or wine. And the way they were sold, it was exactly like a livestock market. Because that's literally what it was, people shopping for humans the same way they'd shop for cattle. Number 2. Humans traded like livestock. In 1245, a merchant named Giacomo de Verraz wrote a letter to his business partner in Constantinople. He was complaining about the quality of his latest shipment from the Black Sea slave markets. The girls are too young, he wrote, and 3 of the boys died during transport. Next time, inspect them better. Check their teeth and muscles like you would with horses. Check their teeth, like horses. That letter, preserved in the Genoese state archives, gives us a window into something most history books skip over. In medieval slave markets, humans weren't just treated like livestock. They were literally sold alongside livestock, using the exact same methods. Picture this. You're in the market square of medieval Seville in 1300. On your left, there's a pen full of goats. The seller is showing customers how healthy they are, pointing out their strong legs and bright eyes. On your right, there's a platform with a dozen human beings standing on it. The seller is doing exactly the same thing, pointing out strong arms, white teeth, clear skin. The pricing worked the same way, too. Animals and humans were both priced based on age, health, strength, and what kind of work they could do. A strong young man might sell for 25 silver coins. A good warhorse cost 30. A dairy cow was maybe 3 coins. Sometimes, literally, a human being was worth less than livestock. And I'm not exaggerating here. We have actual price records from medieval markets. In 1248, the slave market in Palermo kept detailed accounts. Adult male slaves averaged 18 silver tari. Adult females averaged 16. A good horse cost 25 tari. Bull cost 20. Think about that for a second. A bull, an animal that lives maybe 15 years and can basically just pull heavy things, was worth more than a human being who could work for decades, learn skills, raise children who would also be slaves. The reason was simple economics. Europe in the Middle Ages had way more slaves than it knew what to do with. Constant warfare meant a steady supply of prisoners. Viking raids brought thousands of captives from Ireland, Scotland, and Eastern Europe. The Reconquista in Spain created streams of Muslim captives. Crusades in the Baltic brought pagan slaves. Supply was high, demand was scattered, so prices stayed low. But the really disturbing part is how organized it all was. This wasn't just random people selling prisoners from raids. There were professional slave traders who ran businesses for generations. They had standardized practices, established routes, regular customers. Take the Venetian merchant family, called the Morosini. For over 200 years, from 1200 to 1400, they specialized in importing slaves from the Black Sea region. They had offices in Constantinople, Kaffa, and Tana. They owned ships designed specifically for transporting humans. They had contracts with suppliers in Crimea who would deliver specific numbers of slaves on scheduled dates. The Morosinis even developed their own classification system. They divided slaves into categories like premium stock, young, attractive, healthy, working stock, older, stronger, good for manual labor, and bulk stock, children, elderly, disabled people who were sold cheap for whatever work they could do. And they weren't unique. The Genoese had similar operations. So did merchants from Marseille, Barcelona, and Naples. There were probably dozens of these family slave trading dynasties operating across medieval Europe. The logistics were industrial scale. Ships that could carry 200 to 300 slaves at a time. Warehouses in port cities where slaves were kept, fed, and prepared for sale. Financial systems that allowed merchants to buy slaves on credit in one city and pay after selling them in another. The slave markets themselves followed a standard format that you could recognize whether you were in London, Lisbon, or Palermo. There'd be a raised platform or stage in the center. Slaves would be brought up in small groups, usually 5 to 10 at a time. They'd be made to walk around, sometimes jog, to show they weren't lame. Buyers would examine them like livestock buyers examine animals today. Medieval manuscripts describe the process in detail. Buyers would check teeth for age and health, feel muscles to judge strength, look for scars that might indicate past injuries or diseases. For women, they'd check for signs of pregnancy or previous childbirth. The most valuable slaves were put on display first, when buyers had the most money to spend. Less valuable ones were sold later, often in bulk lots. Children were usually sold with their mothers until age 7 to 8, then separated and sold individually. And just like livestock markets, there were seasonal patterns. Spring was the busy season because that's when people needed extra workers for planting and construction. Prices were highest then. Winter was slow, fewer buyers, lower prices. Merchants would often hold slaves in warehouses during slow periods rather than sell at a loss. There were even specialist markets for different types of slaves. The market in Cordoba was known for beautiful women who became concubines or entertainers. Markets in northern Italy specialized in strong men for agricultural work. Venice was famous for exotic slaves, Africans, Asians, unusual-looking Europeans who were bought as conversation pieces by wealthy families. The most disturbing part? Quality control and customer service. If a slave got sick within a week of purchase, you could return them for a refund. If they died within a month, you got store credit. If they ran away, the seller was often responsible for replacement. Some merchants offered payment plans. Buy a slave today, pay in installments over 6 months. Others offered trade-ins. Bring your old slave. When you buy a new one, get a discount. The parallels to livestock trading weren't accidental. Many slave merchants also traded in animals. They used the same ships, the same warehouses, the same accounting systems. From their perspective, it was all just cargo that happened to be alive. But here's what makes it even worse. The livestock trade had regulations. There were laws about how to transport animals, minimum space requirements, rules about feeding and watering. For slaves? Almost nothing. They were packed into ship holds like cargo, fed the minimum to keep them alive, chained to prevent escape. The mortality rate during transport was horrible. For a typical voyage from the Black Sea to Italy, about 2 weeks, you could expect 10 to 15% of your human cargo to die en route. Merchants factored this into their pricing. They'd ship 100 slaves expecting to sell 85 to 90. And unlike with animals, there was no economic incentive to keep slaves comfortable during transport. A cow needs to be healthy and well-fed when it reaches market. A slave just needs to be alive. Their condition could be improved with a few days of rest and better food before sale. This is the reality behind medieval Europe's economic boom. Some of the continent's most beautiful cities, some of its greatest architectural achievements, some of its most celebrated cultural developments. All of it built on a foundation of treating human beings like livestock. But wait until you hear about who was doing the capturing and transporting. Because when I tell you about the Vikings' role in all this, it's going to change how you think about those heroic Norse warriors forever. Number 3. Viking slave raids, the northern supply chain. Everything you think you know about Vikings is wrong. I grew up watching movies where Vikings were brave warriors exploring new lands, fighting epic battles, maybe doing some trading on the side. Noble savages with cool helmets and dramatic speeches about Valhalla. Then I read the actual medieval chronicles. The Vikings weren't primarily warriors or explorers. They were slave traders. Professional human traffickers who built an international business empire on kidnapping people. Here's a number that will blow your mind. Between 800 and 1100 AD, Vikings captured and sold an estimated 1 million people. 1 million. That's not warriors killed in battle. That's civilians, men, women, children, kidnapped from their homes and sold in slave markets across Europe and beyond. The word the Vikings used for slave raids was stranding, which literally means beach landing, because that's how it worked. Viking ships would appear suddenly on beaches from Ireland to Russia. They'd grab everyone they could, load them onto ships, and disappear before any organized resistance could respond. But this wasn't random piracy. It was systematic, organized, and incredibly sophisticated. The Vikings developed what was essentially the first international human trafficking network. They had supply routes from Greenland to Constantinople. They had established markets in Dublin, York, Kiev, and Novgorod. They had seasonal schedules, preferred hunting grounds, and even customer pre-orders. Let me tell you about Dublin, because Dublin in the Viking Age wasn't the charming Irish city you might visit today. It was the largest slave market in Western Europe. The Vikings founded Dublin in 841 AD, specifically as a slave trading port. They called it Dublin, the Black Pool, because ships would dock in a natural harbor that looked dark from above. But locals started calling it the Pool of Tears because of the thousands of captives who passed through. At its peak, around 950 AD, Dublin's slave market was processing over 1,000 people per month. That's 12,000 human beings per year flowing through one city. The Vikings had built warehouses to store slaves, processing facilities to prepare them for sale, and financial systems to handle the massive cash flows. The operation was industrial scale. Viking raiders would hit targets all across the British Isles and Western Europe, then funnel their captives to Dublin for export. Ships would arrive from as far away as Iceland, bringing slaves captured in Greenland. Other ships would carry Dublin's human cargo to markets in France, Spain, and beyond. The Irish chronicles describe it in horrifying detail. The Annals of Ulster record year after year of raids. They carried off a great number of women into captivity. They plundered and burned, taking many prisoners. Many people were led away into slavery. But it gets worse. The Vikings didn't just grab random people. They developed targeting strategies based on market demand. Young women were the most valuable, especially if they were attractive or had useful skills. So Vikings specifically targeted convents and wealthy households where they'd find educated women. The monastery at Glendalough was raided 7 times in 50 years, partly because it was wealthy, but mostly because it housed young women who brought high prices in slave markets. Children were extremely valuable because they could be trained for specific purposes and would work for many years. Viking raids on settlements often focused on capturing kids between ages 8 to 15. Younger children were harder to transport and often died during the journey. Older teenagers might resist or escape. Skilled men were targeted too. Blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, anyone with useful abilities. Vikings would sometimes interrogate captives to identify the most skilled workers, then specifically hunt for them. They even had market research. Viking traders would visit slave markets to see what types of people were selling for the highest prices, then pass that information back to the raiding crews. If Byzantine customers were paying premium prices for blonde hair, the next season would see more raids on Scandinavian and Germanic settlements. If Islamic markets wanted skilled craftsmen, Vikings would target workshops and manufacturing centers. The scale of this operation was massive. Archaeological evidence from Dublin shows that the city's population in the 10th century was about 4,000 permanent residents. But the slave-holding facilities could house up to 2,000 people at a time. That means Dublin's temporary slave population was sometimes half as large as the entire permanent population. And Dublin was just one hub. The Vikings had similar operations in York, which they called Jorvik. They controlled slave markets in the Orkney Islands, the Isle of Man, and dozens of smaller ports along the European coast. But here's what's really disturbing. This wasn't just business, it was personal. Viking society integrated slavery so deeply that owning slaves became a mark of status and success. A successful Viking warrior was expected to own slaves. They called them thralls, and having many thralls showed that you were prosperous and powerful. Viking graves contained slave sacrifices, people killed to serve their masters in the afterlife. Viking ships were often crewed partly by slaves who were literally chained to the oars. The Icelandic sagas, which are some of our best sources for Viking culture, mention slaves constantly. They talk about capturing thralls, buying thralls, working thralls to death, breeding thralls for specific purposes. It's presented as completely normal, like discussing livestock management. But the international connections were the most sophisticated part of the operation. Vikings weren't just selling to local European markets. They were plugged into trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Central Asia. Through Russian rivers, Viking slave traders could reach the Caspian Sea and connect with Islamic markets in Baghdad and beyond. Irish slaves captured in Dublin might end up in the palaces of Cordoba or the harems of Constantinople. Finnish children, who were apparently highly prized for their blonde hair and fair skin, were shipped all the way to Crimean markets where they sold for premium prices. The Vikings developed specialized ships for slave transport. These were different from their famous longships. They were broader, with more cargo space and less focus on speed. They had built-in holding areas where slaves could be chained during transport. Some could carry 200 to 300 people at a time. They also developed routes that minimized risk and maximized profit. Instead of sailing directly from capture sites to markets, they'd use a network of intermediate ports where slaves could be transferred, sorted, and redistributed. This made it harder for victims' families or local authorities to track and recover captives. And they had customer service. If a slave died shortly after sale, Viking traders would often provide replacements. If a customer wanted specific types of people, they'd take orders and fulfill them on future raids. Some wealthy Byzantine and Islamic customers had standing orders: deliver 20 blonde women and 10 skilled craftsmen every spring. The profits were enormous. A healthy adult slave might sell for 8 to 12 ounces of silver. A Viking ship could carry 100 to 150 slaves, generating revenue equivalent to several years' worth of normal trade goods. No wonder so many young Norsemen chose slaving over farming or fishing. But the most disturbing part is how normalized it became. Viking poetry celebrates slave raids. Their laws include detailed regulations about slave ownership. Their religious practices incorporated slave sacrifice. Capturing and selling humans wasn't a criminal activity or even a morally questionable one. It was just business. The end of the Viking Age is usually dated to 1066, when Harald Hardrada was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But the Viking slave trade continued long after that. Norwegian and Danish merchants were still operating slave markets in Ireland into the 1100s. The trade routes and business practices the Vikings established continued to shape European slavery for centuries. So next time you see a movie about brave Viking explorers, remember this. Those ships crossing the Atlantic weren't carrying heroes seeking new lands. They were carrying some of history's most successful human traffickers, running an international kidnapping operation that destroyed the lives of over 1 million people. But the Vikings were just the supply side of the equation. The real money, the real power, the real organization, that was controlled by the merchant republics of Italy. And when you hear what they built on the foundation of human misery, it's going to change how you look at some of Europe's most beautiful cities. Number 4. The Mediterranean hotspot, Venice and Genoa's golden trade. I want you to imagine something. You're standing in St. Mark's Square in Venice today, surrounded by stunning Byzantine architecture, sipping espresso at a sidewalk cafe, watching tourists feed pigeons. Beautiful, right? Romantic and elegant. Now imagine the same square in 1350. Same beautiful buildings, but the smell in the air isn't coffee and sea breeze. It's unwashed human bodies, fierce sweat, and the stench of ship holds that haven't been properly cleaned. Because right where those tourists are taking selfies, there used to be one of Europe's largest slave markets. Venice and Genoa, two of medieval Europe's wealthiest and most powerful cities, built their entire fortunes on human trafficking. Not as a side business or an unfortunate necessity, as their primary source of income. And they were good at it. Terrifyingly good. Let me start with some numbers that will make your jaw drop. In 1381, just 1 year, the city of Genoa recorded 7,223 slaves within the city limits. That's just the ones who were officially registered for tax purposes. The actual number was probably twice as high. Venice was even bigger. During the peak of the medieval slave trade, around 1400, Venice probably had 15,000 to 20,000 slaves and a total population of about 100,000. 1 in 5 people in the city was human property. But here's what's really crazy. These weren't just domestic servants or manual laborers. The Italian city-states created the first truly industrial slave economy in medieval Europe. They had slave-operated factories, slave-powered shipping, slave-built infrastructure. Entire neighborhoods where slaves outnumbered free people. The Venetians call their slave quarter the ghetto nuovo, the new ghetto. The word ghetto actually comes from the Venetian word ghetto, meaning foundry, because that area housed the metalworking slaves. But it became the model for every ghetto in Europe. Now, how did 2 Italian cities become the center of an international human trafficking empire? It starts with geography and opportunism. Venice and Genoa were perfectly positioned to control trade between Europe and the Byzantine Empire. They had the ships, the navigation skills, and the capital to operate long-distance trade routes. Initially, they were shipping normal cargo, spices, silk, precious metals, that kind of thing. But then they realized something. Slaves were lighter than most cargo, more valuable per pound than almost anything else, and there was unlimited demand. A ship that might carry 50 tons of grain could carry 200 to 300 slaves in the same space. And while a ton of grain might sell for 10 silver coins, a healthy adult slave sold for 20 to 30. The math was obvious. So they started small. Venetian merchants would buy a few slaves in Constantinople or the Black Sea ports, then sell them in Western European markets for huge profits. But as the business grew, they realized they needed to control the entire supply chain. That's when things got really organized and really dark. The Venetians established their first major slave colony in Sudak, in Crimea, in 1206. This wasn't just a trading post, it was a purpose-built slave processing facility. They had holding pens, medical facilities to treat sick slaves, training areas where slaves could be taught specific skills that would increase their value. The Genoese went even bigger. In 1266, they established the colony of Caffa on the Black Sea coast. Caffa became the largest slave market in the medieval world. At its peak, it was processing over 20,000 slaves per year. That's 400 people per week being bought, sold, and shipped out like cattle. But the Italian cities didn't just buy and resell slaves. They created an entire ecosystem around human trafficking. They developed specialized slave ships with custom-built holding areas. These ships had multiple levels of platforms where slaves could be chained during transport. They had minimal ventilation because fresh air was less important than maximizing cargo space. They had dedicated areas for sick slaves so diseases wouldn't spread to the valuable ones. They created slave insurance systems. Merchants could buy policies that would compensate them if slaves died during transport, escaped after arrival, or turned out to have hidden illnesses. The insurance companies made huge profits because they charged high premiums, but paid out only for documented losses. They established slave financing systems. Small merchants who couldn't afford to buy slaves outright could get loans from Venetian or Genoese banks, secured by the slaves themselves. If the loans went bad, the banks would repossess the human collateral and sell it themselves. They even created slave futures markets. Wealthy customers could place orders for specific types of slaves to be delivered months in advance. Young blonde women for noble households. Strong men for galley crews. Skilled craftsmen for manufacturing operations. The Italian merchants would take these orders, then organize raids or purchases to fulfill them. The scale of the operation was incredible. The Venetian state archives contain over 3,000 slave sale contracts from the 14th century alone. These weren't private transactions, they were official state business, regulated and taxed by the government. Venice charged a 5% transaction tax on every slave sale. That doesn't sound like much until you realize they were processing thousands of slaves per year. The slave trade was providing 20 to 30% of Venice's total government revenue. That's how they funded the construction of St. Mark's Basilica, the Doge's Palace, and all those other architectural wonders tourists admire today. The Genoese were even more direct about it. They had a specific tax called the Tassa sui servi, literally slave tax, that generated more revenue than their taxes on grain, wine, and textiles combined. But the business model was even more sophisticated than just buying and selling. The Italian cities created value-added services around slavery. They had slave training programs. Young slaves could be taught specific skills, languages, crafts, music, even reading and writing that would make them more valuable. A trained scribe or translator might sell for 5 times as much as an unskilled laborer. They had slave breeding programs. Female slaves who produced healthy children were more valuable, so merchants would sometimes hold onto young women specifically for breeding purposes. The children would be sold separately or used to create match sets, families that could be sold together to wealthy customers. They had slave customization services. Customers could specify exactly what they wanted: height, hair color, age, skills, even personality traits, and the Italian merchants would try to find or create matches. It was like a medieval catalog system for human beings. And they had international delivery services. A customer in London could place an order with a Venetian merchant who would source the slaves from Black Sea markets and arrange shipping to England. The whole transaction could be handled remotely, with the customer never seeing the slaves until they arrived. The most disturbing part is how respectable it all became. These weren't criminal organizations operating in the shadows. They were legitimate businesses, recognized by governments, blessed by the church, celebrated by society. The richest families in Venice and Genoa, the Mocenigo's, the Contarinis, the Dorias, the Spinolas, all made their fortunes in the slave trade. Their palaces, their art collections, their political power, all of it built on human trafficking. And they weren't ashamed of it. They commissioned paintings showing their slave trading operations. They put slave ships in their family coats of arms. The Venetian merchant Giacomo Badoer kept detailed records of his business operations in Constantinople during the 1430s. His account books, which survive in the Venetian archives, show that slave trading generated more profit for him than all his other businesses combined. He treated it as normal commerce, noting slave purchases right alongside records of buying spices and silk. But here's what makes it even worse. The Italian city-states didn't just participate in the slave trade. They innovated it. They created techniques and systems that would later be copied by Atlantic slave traders. They developed the tight pack method of shipping slaves, cramming as many people as possible into the smallest space to maximize profits. They created standardized slave classifications based on age, gender, ethnicity, and skills. They pioneered the use of credit and insurance in slave trading. Most importantly, they proved that slavery could be industrialized. Instead of small-scale domestic slavery or agricultural work gangs, they showed how slave labor could power entire urban economies. Manufacturing, construction, shipping, services, all of it run primarily on slave labor. The wealth this generated was enormous. By 1400, Venice and Genoa were probably the 2 richest cities in Europe, with higher per capita incomes than anywhere else on the continent. Their citizens enjoyed luxury goods from around the world, magnificent architecture, sophisticated culture, and advanced technology. All of it paid for by selling human beings. The slave trade continued in Italy well into the Renaissance. Christopher Columbus himself owned slaves and was involved in slave trading operations. The techniques and capital that funded the age of exploration came largely from medieval slave profits. Even today, if you visit Venice or Genoa, you can see the legacy of the slave trade everywhere. The magnificent palaces, the elaborate churches, the sophisticated infrastructure, all of it built on a foundation of human misery. But here's a question that might be bothering you. If slavery was so profitable and so widespread, who was getting enslaved? Were these just prisoners of war and criminals? Or was it ordinary people, families, children? The answer is going to shock you. Because when you learn who could become a slave in medieval Europe, you'll realize that almost no one was safe. Number 5. Who was enslaved? Anyone could be next. In 1347, a 12-year-old girl named Margaret was sold in the slave market of Bristol for 18 silver coins. She wasn't a prisoner of war. She wasn't from some distant, conquered land. She was English, born free, in a small village near York. Her parents had sold her. The harvest had failed 2 years in a row. The family was starving. They already owed money to local merchants and couldn't pay their debts. So they sold their daughter to buy food for their 2 sons. They told themselves it was temporary, that they'd buy her back when times got better. They never saw her again. Margaret's story, recorded in the court records of medieval England, shows us something most people don't understand about medieval slavery. This wasn't just about raiding enemy territories or capturing foreign prisoners. Medieval Europe had developed a system where almost anyone could end up enslaved. Free people could become slaves. Citizens could become property. Children could be sold by their own parents. And it happened all the time. Let me break down the main ways people became slaves in medieval Europe, because it's going to destroy some myths you probably believe. First, were captives. This is the one most people know about. When armies conquered cities or won battles, they'd often enslave the losing population. During the Crusades, Christian forces enslaved thousands of Muslims. During the Reconquista in Spain, both sides enslaved prisoners. When the Mongols invaded Eastern Europe, entire populations were captured and sold. But here's what's disturbing: warfare was almost constant in medieval Europe. There wasn't some long, peaceful period interrupted by occasional wars. There were wars happening somewhere almost all the time. Border conflicts, succession disputes, religious wars, trade wars, personal feuds between nobles that escalated to military action. Every single one of these conflicts generated slaves. A small border skirmish might produce 50 to 100 captives. A major siege could produce thousands. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade generated an estimated 30,000 new slaves in a single day. Second, debt slavery. This is where it gets really dark, because debt slavery could affect anyone. Medieval European law allowed people to sell themselves or their family members into slavery to pay debts. If you couldn't pay what you owed, creditors could force you to work as a slave until the debt was satisfied. Since slaves weren't paid wages, this often meant slavery for life. But it gets worse. Children could inherit their parents' slave status. So if your father sold himself into debt slavery and died before working off the debt, you became a slave to pay his obligations. Entire family lines could be enslaved for generations because of one ancestor's financial problems. The records are full of these cases. In 1203, a merchant named William Carpenter in London sold himself and his two sons into slavery to pay debts totaling 40 silver marks. His wife and daughter were spared only because they were valuable free and could work to support themselves. In 1267, the court records of Paris show a family of 5 parents and 3 children who were all enslaved because they couldn't pay rent on their farm. The landlord claimed a right to their labor until the debt was satisfied. The debt was 12 silver coins. The family worked as slaves for over 20 years and never earned enough to buy their freedom. Third, criminal slavery. People convicted of certain crimes could be sentenced to slavery instead of execution or imprisonment. This sounds reasonable until you realize what counted as crimes in medieval Europe. Stealing food when you were starving? Slavery. Poaching a rabbit on noble land? Slavery. Speaking disrespectfully to a church official? Slavery. In some places, being unable to pay fines for minor offenses automatically resulted in enslavement. The English legal code called these villenage, basically slavery with a different name. If you were convicted of certain crimes, you and your descendants could be bound to serve a lord indefinitely. Your children would be born slaves. Their children would be born slaves. It could continue for generations. Fourth, and this is the one that really shows how vulnerable everyone was: kidnapping and slave raids. Not just by Vikings or foreign armies, but by professional slave hunters operating within supposedly civilized Christian kingdoms. Slave raiding was a legitimate business in medieval Europe. There were professional kidnapping gangs that would target isolated farms, small villages, or traveling merchants. They'd capture everyone they could, then sell them in distant markets where no one would recognize the victims. The records show this happened constantly. In 1156, a gang operating near Toulouse captured an entire wedding party, 23 people, including the bride and groom, and sold them in Spanish markets. In 1203, slave raiders hit a monastery in Ireland and captured 47 monks and students. In 1278, kidnappers took 18 children from a village fair in England. These weren't random crimes. They were organized businesses with established routes, regular customers, and protection from corrupt officials. Some noble families were secretly involved in slave raiding, taking a cut of the profits in exchange for not investigating kidnappings in their territories. And here's something that will blow your mind: children were specifically targeted because they were more valuable and easier to transport. A healthy 10-year-old might sell for twice as much as an adult because they had more working years ahead of them and could be trained for specific purposes. The records from Genoa show that about 40% of slaves in Italian markets were under 16 years old. These weren't war orphans or abandoned children. Many were kidnapped from their families or sold by desperate parents. Fifth, ethnic targeting. Certain groups were systematically enslaved based on their ethnicity or religion. Slavic peoples were targeted so heavily that their ethnic name became the word for slaves. Irish people were captured in huge numbers by Viking and English raiders. Roma people, then called Egyptians, were enslaved throughout Europe. Muslims in Christian territories could be enslaved almost automatically. Jews faced similar persecution. Pagan peoples in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia were considered legitimate targets for slave raiders even after many had converted to Christianity. But the scariest part is how easily free people could lose their status. Medieval law was complicated and contradictory. A person might be free in one kingdom but considered enslaved property when they crossed the border. Someone who inherited their freedom from their parents could lose it through marriage, debt, criminal conviction, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Women were especially vulnerable. In many medieval legal systems, women had limited rights and could be transferred as property when they married. A free woman who married a slave often became enslaved herself. A free woman whose husband was enslaved might automatically join him in bondage. Children of mixed marriages, one parent free, one enslaved, usually followed the status of the mother. But local laws varied, and corrupt officials could sometimes declare children enslaved regardless of their parent status. The most disturbing cases involve people who were technically free, but lived in conditions identical to slavery. These were called serfs or villains, people bound to specific lands who could be bought and sold along with the property. They couldn't leave, couldn't marry without permission, couldn't own property, and could be punished or killed by their lords with minimal legal consequences. The difference between a serf and a slave was mostly technical. Serfs were supposedly bound to the land rather than owned as personal property. But in practice, they lived as slaves and their children inherited the same bondage. And the numbers are staggering. In medieval England, probably 60 to 80% of the population lived in some form of bondage. They weren't free peasants working their own farms. They were essentially slaves tied to specific properties, owned by lords who could treat them however they wanted. Think about this: in a typical medieval European kingdom, the majority of people were not free. They were property, either directly as slaves or indirectly as serfs. Freedom was the exception, not the rule. But here's what makes it even more horrifying. There was no reliable way to prove you were free. There were no birth certificates, no citizenship documents, no official records that ordinary people could access. Your freedom depended on the testimony of people who knew you, and if you were far from home or those people were dead, you had no protection. Slave traders would sometimes capture free people and simply claim they were already slaves. Without documentation, how could the victims prove otherwise? Especially if they were sold in distant markets where no one knew them. The court records are full of cases where people spent years trying to prove they had been born free. Most failed. The legal system was designed to favor slave owners who had money and political connections over victims who had neither. So when someone asks who was enslaved in medieval Europe, the answer is simple. Almost anyone could be. Free birth was no protection. Citizenship meant nothing. Christian faith offered limited safety. Even noble blood wasn't a guarantee. There are records of minor nobility being enslaved after falling into debt or losing political conflicts. Medieval Europe created a system where human freedom was conditional, temporary, and always at risk. Most people lived their entire lives knowing they could lose everything: their liberty, their families, their humanity, through bad luck, bad debts, or simply being in the wrong place when slave raiders arrived. Well, you might be thinking, at least the wealthy were safe, right? The nobles and rich merchants. Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because the wealthy didn't just stay safe from slavery, they turned it into a sick form of entertainment and status display. And when you hear about the exotic slave craze that swept through Europe's upper classes, you'll understand just how depraved this system became. Number 6. The exotic slave craze, humans as status symbols. In 1402, the Duke of Burgundy threw a feast to celebrate his daughter's wedding. The guests included kings, princes, and the wealthiest merchants in Europe. The entertainment? A parade of his slave collection. 23 slaves from around the world were brought out, and displayed like living art pieces. There was a pale-skinned woman from Greenland with white blonde hair, a dark-skinned man from Nubia who was over 7 feet tall, twin girls from somewhere in Asia who spoke no European languages, a dwarf from Russia who had been trained to perform acrobatic tricks. The guests applauded and made offers to buy some of the slaves for their own collections. The Duke was gracious but declined most offers. These weren't for sale, they were his private museum of human curiosities. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a trend that swept through Europe's wealthy elite during the later Middle Ages. Rich people didn't just buy slaves for labor. They collected exotic human beings the way we might collect rare art or vintage cars. It was about showing off wealth, sophistication, and access to global trade networks. And it was absolutely disgusting. The exotic slave craze started in the late 1200s as trade networks expanded and European merchants gained access to more diverse populations. Wealthy families began competing to own the most unusual, rare, or beautiful slaves they could find. Italian merchant families were the trendsetters. The Medici Bank had agents across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East who were instructed to watch for unusual slaves that might interest their wealthy clients. They kept catalogs, actual written catalogs, describing available exotic slaves like they were luxury goods. One surviving catalog from 1367 lists offerings including a Moorish girl of exceptional beauty, skilled in mathematics and astronomy, a pair of blonde twins from the Baltic region, age 14, trained in music, and a dark-skinned giant from Africa, over 6 feet tall, suitable for intimidating guests or outdoor work. The prices were astronomical. A normal working slave might cost 15 to 20 silver coins. An exotic slave could sell for 100 to 200 silver coins, sometimes more. The Moorish girl mentioned in that catalog sold for 180 silver coins, more than most people made in 5 years. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how these human beings were treated. Exotic slaves weren't expected to do normal work. They were living decorations, conversation pieces, entertainment systems. Their job was to be unusual and interesting for their owners' amusement. Some were dressed in elaborate costumes that emphasized their foreign origins. African slaves might be clothed in fake tribal outfits that had nothing to do with their actual cultures. Asian slaves were dressed in silk robes and had their faces painted white. Northern Europeans were dressed like barbarians in furs and primitive jewelry. Others were trained to perform specific roles that played up stereotypes about their origins. African slaves might be taught to dance or play drums. Asian slaves were taught to serve tea in ceremonial ways. Slavic slaves were trained to perform wild warrior dances. The psychological torture was incredible. These people were cut off from their cultures, their families, their languages, and forced to perform caricatures of their own identities for the amusement of people who saw them as exotic animals. Some wealthy families specialized in collecting slaves from specific regions. The Gonzaga family of Mantua was famous for their collection of Slavic slaves. They had over 40 people from various Eastern European ethnic groups, all housed in special quarters and brought out for display during social events. The Este family of Ferrara collected African slaves. They had representatives in North African markets specifically looking for people with unusual features, very dark skin, distinctive scarification, unusual height or build. They treated their human collection like a private zoo. But the absolute worst were the families who collected child slaves specifically for their innocence and trainability. Children could be completely shaped by their owners, taught to speak only certain languages, trained in specific skills, even given new names and false histories. The Visconti family of Milan was notorious for this. They would buy children under age 10 from various ethnic backgrounds, then raise them in isolation with carefully constructed identities. A Chinese girl might be told she was a princess rescued from distant wars. A black boy might be told he was from a kingdom of warriors who sent him as a gift. These children would grow up completely disconnected from their real origins, believing whatever stories their owners invented. It was psychological child abuse on an industrial scale. The exotic slave trade also created some of the most sophisticated human trafficking networks in medieval history. Merchants developed connections from Iceland to Ethiopia, from Ireland to Central Asia. They could fulfill specific orders for almost any type of person a wealthy customer might want. Account books from Venetian merchants show orders like one red-haired girl from Scotland, aged 12 to 15, must be able to read Latin, or twin boys from Africa, matching heights, trained in wrestling. These weren't general requests. They were precise specifications that merchants would work for months or years to fulfill. The logistics were incredible. A wealthy customer in Paris might place an order with a Genoese merchant, who would contact agents in Constantinople, who would send word to traders in Crimean markets, who would eventually locate suitable candidates in the slave markets of the Black Sea region. The whole process might take 2 years from order to delivery. But wealthy customers were willing to wait and pay premium prices for exactly what they wanted. Some merchants specialized in finishing exotic slaves, training them in specific skills or behaviors that would make them more appealing to wealthy buyers. There were essentially slave schools where people were taught languages, musical instruments, dancing, reading, writing, mathematics, or specialized crafts. The most expensive exotic slaves were those with rare combinations of features and skills. A beautiful African woman who could speak multiple languages and play musical instruments might sell for more than most people's entire life earnings. But the craze also created some truly bizarre markets. There was demand for slaves with physical abnormalities, giants, dwarfs, people with unusual skin conditions or deformities. These people were treated like circus freaks, bought and sold for their entertainment value. Some wealthy families hosted exotic slave competitions where they would display their collections and vote on the most unusual or impressive specimens. Winners received prizes and social recognition. The slaves were literally being judged like livestock at a county fair. The psychological damage to these human beings is hard to imagine. They were completely isolated from anyone who shared their background or could understand their experiences. They were expected to be grateful for being rescued from their home cultures and brought to civilized Europe. They were punished if they showed homesickness, spoke their native languages, or tried to maintain any connection to their origins. Many didn't survive the psychological torture. Suicide rates among exotic slaves were extremely high. Others went insane from the isolation and identity confusion. The lucky ones died young from diseases they had no immunity to. But the wealthy didn't care. Dead exotic slaves could be replaced. There were always more unusual people available in the global slave markets. The exotic slave craze lasted for over 200 years, from about 1250 to 1450. It only ended when the Ottoman Empire's expansion cut off many of the supply routes, making exotic slaves too expensive even for the super wealthy. But the psychological and cultural damage was permanent. Entire ethnic groups were reduced to stereotypes in European minds. The idea that non-European peoples were naturally suited for entertainment, display, or exotic service became deeply embedded in European culture. These attitudes would later shape European colonial policies, the Atlantic slave trade, and centuries of racism and exploitation. The medieval exotic slave craze wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was the foundation for some of humanity's worst subsequent behavior. And here's the truly sick part. The wealthy families who participated in this weren't monsters or criminals. They were the most educated, cultured, religious people in medieval society. They attended church regularly, patronized the arts, donated to charity, and were generally respected as pillars of their communities. They saw no contradiction between their Christian faith and their ownership of human beings. They genuinely believed that exposing exotic slaves to European culture was a form of charity, rescuing them from barbarism and paganism. This is what made medieval slavery so insidious. It wasn't just cruel, it was rationalized, systematized, and celebrated by the people who were supposed to be society's moral leaders. But speaking of the slave markets themselves, you haven't heard anything yet. Because the actual process of buying and selling human beings was even more brutal and dehumanizing than you can imagine. Number 7. Brutal slave auctions, the theater of human misery. I need to warn you before we get into this section. What I'm about to describe is going to be disturbing. These are real events, documented in medieval records, that show human beings at their absolute worst. In 1347, a Genoese merchant named Benedetto Zaccaria wrote a letter to his business partner describing a slave auction he attended in Caffa. His words, preserved in the Genoese state archives, give us a window into something most history books skip over entirely. The auctioneer had them parade in circles like horses at market. The buyers examined their teeth, felt their muscles, checked the women for pregnancy signs. One buyer made a young girl run back and forth to test her stamina. Another had an old man lift heavy stones to prove his strength. It was like watching farmers buy livestock, except the animals were human beings who understood every humiliating moment. This wasn't unusual. This was standard procedure. Medieval slave auctions were designed to be dehumanizing spectacles that reduced people to their purely economic value. And they were incredibly popular public entertainment. Picture this, you're in the main square of medieval Palermo on a Tuesday morning in 1320. There's a wooden platform in the center, about 4 feet high so everyone can see. Benches are arranged in rows for wealthy buyers. Poor people stand in the back to watch the show. The auctioneer climbs onto the platform and starts his pitch like he's selling animals at a livestock fair. Fresh cargo from the Black Sea. Healthy stock, all examined by physicians. Strong men for heavy work, beautiful women for households, children ready for training. Then the slaves are brought out. They've been prepared for this moment like livestock being prepared for market. They've been washed, their hair has been combed or cut in styles that make them look younger or healthier. Sick slaves have been given stimulants to make them appear energetic. Weak slaves have been fed better than usual to put some weight on them. But here's the really sick part. They're often partially or completely naked. Not because medieval people were prudes about clothing, but because buyers wanted to inspect the merchandise thoroughly. Men were stripped to show their muscle development and check for scars or injuries that might indicate they were prone to violence or couldn't work effectively. Women were examined for signs of pregnancy, previous childbirth, or sexually transmitted diseases. Children were checked for deformities or signs of malnutrition. The auctioneer would point out each person's good qualities like a horse trader showing off a mare. Look at this young man, strong back, perfect for farm work or construction. And see how straight his legs are. He'll never go lame on you. Buyers would come up onto the platform to examine the slaves more closely. They'd open people's mouths to check their teeth, feel their arms to judge their strength, look for signs of disease or injury. For women, the examination was even more invasive and humiliating. Buyers would check their hips to judge whether they'd be good for breeding. They'd examine their breasts to see if they were nursing or capable of nursing. They'd ask personal questions about their sexual history and menstrual cycles. All of this happened in public, in front of crowds of spectators who treated it like entertainment. People would bring their families to watch slave auctions the same way they'd attend a festival or fair. Children would point and laugh at the naked slaves. Adults would make jokes about their appearance or speculate about what kind of work they'd be good for. It was a community social event built around the systematic humiliation of human beings. The auction format was designed to create competition and drive up prices. The auctioneer would start with a low bid, then encourage buyers to compete against each other. Come now, gentlemen. This fine specimen is worth more than 15 coins. Look at those muscles. What am I bid? Buyers would shout out higher and higher offers while the slaves stood on the platform, listening to their lives being priced and sold. The psychological torture was incredible, hearing strangers debate your value like you were a piece of furniture. Sometimes family members were auctioned separately to get higher prices. Parents would be sold first, then children, with the parents forced to watch their children being examined and bid on by strangers. Husbands and wives would be split up, sold to different owners who might live in different countries. The records describe scenes that are almost impossible to believe. Children crying for their parents while being dragged away by new owners. Mothers trying to nurse babies who were being sold separately. Elderly people begging not to be separated from adult children who were their caregivers. But the buyers showed no emotion. This was business. They were making rational economic decisions about human resources. Some auctions had special features to increase entertainment value and prices. Fighting auctions where male slaves would be forced to wrestle or box each other, with the winner selling for a higher price. Skill demonstrations where slaves would be required to show their abilities. Craftsmen making simple objects, musicians playing instruments, dancers performing routines. The most disturbing were beauty contests for female slaves. Young women would be made to pose and parade while buyers judged their attractiveness. Winners would be sold as concubines or entertainers for premium prices. Losers would be sold for domestic work at lower prices. These weren't private sales between discreet parties. They were public spectacles advertised in advance. Towns would post announcements about upcoming slave auctions like they were advertising theater performances. Great slave auction this Saturday. Fresh cargo from Crimea, including beautiful young women, strong workers, and trained craftsmen. Entertainment and refreshments available. Bring the whole family. The social aspect was important. Attending slave auctions was a way for wealthy people to show off their purchasing power and social status. Being able to afford expensive slaves demonstrated that you were successful and important. Some buyers would attend auctions just to be seen bidding on high-priced slaves, even if they didn't really want to buy them. It was like driving an expensive car or wearing designer clothes, a public display of wealth and status. The auctioneers were skilled entertainers who knew how to work the crowd and maximize prices. They'd tell stories about where the slaves came from, emphasize their exotic origins or special skills, create urgency by claiming other buyers were interested. This beautiful young woman was captured from a noble family in Kiev. She's educated, speaks 3 languages, and look at that golden hair. There's a buyer from Paris who's made an offer, but I'm giving you local buyers the first chance. Most of it was probably lies, but it worked. Buyers would get caught up in the excitement and bid higher than they'd planned. The payment systems were sophisticated. Cash sales, credit arrangements, payment plans, even barter trades where buyers would exchange goods or other slaves. Some auctions accepted livestock as payment. You could trade horses or cattle for human beings. Record keeping was meticulous. Every sale was documented with the slave's name, age, origin, price, and buyer information. These records were kept for tax purposes and to resolve disputes about ownership. The slaves themselves had no legal rights in these transactions. They couldn't refuse to be sold, couldn't choose their buyers, couldn't negotiate their treatment. They were property being transferred from one owner to another. After the auction, new owners would often brand their purchases like cattle, marking them with hot irons to show ownership and discourage escape attempts. The brands were usually simple symbols or letters, often placed on the face or hands where they'd be visible to anyone who might help an escaped slave. The whole system was designed to break people's spirits and make them accept their fate. By the time someone had been through the capture, transportation, preparation, and auction process, they'd been so thoroughly dehumanized that resistance seemed impossible. And it worked. Most slaves accepted their situation and tried to make the best of it rather than fight a system that seemed impossible to overcome. But here's what makes the auction system even more disturbing. The people organizing and attending these events were often the same people sitting in church on Sunday, listening to sermons about Christian charity and the brotherhood of all humanity. How they reconcile buying and selling human beings with their religious beliefs. How did the church respond to this massive slave trade happening right in the centers of Christian civilization? The answer is going to shock you. Because the church's role in medieval slavery was way more complicated and way more hypocritical than you can imagine. Number 8. The church's complicated role, holy hypocrisy. Pope Gregory VII stood before a crowd of thousands in Rome in 1089 and declared that all Christians were equal in the eyes of God. No Christian shall hold another Christian in bondage, he proclaimed. For we are all brothers in Christ, and slavery is an abomination before the Lord. The crowd cheered. The nobles applauded. The merchants nodded approvingly. Then they all went home and continued buying, selling, and owning human beings exactly like they had before. Because there was a loophole big enough to drive a slave ship through. The church's official position on slavery in medieval Europe was simple. Christians couldn't enslave other Christians. But non-Christians? That was different. Pagans, Muslims, Jews, and anyone else outside the faith were fair game. And since the definition of Christian was flexible, and most slaves came from outside Christian territories, the rule changed almost nothing. This wasn't accidental. The church had developed a sophisticated theological justification for slavery that let Christian merchants and nobles continue their profitable human trafficking while maintaining their religious credentials. The argument went like this. Slavery was a result of sin entering the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience. Some people were naturally suited to serve others as punishment for humanity's fallen state. Enslaving pagans was actually an act of charity because it exposed them to Christian teaching and gave them a chance at salvation they wouldn't have otherwise. It was complete nonsense, but it worked. Let me show you how the system actually operated, because the gap between the church's official teachings and its actual practices was enormous. The church officially condemned the enslavement of Christians, but it defined Christian very narrowly. Recent converts didn't count. They could be enslaved until they proved their faith was genuine. Eastern Orthodox Christians were questionable. They might be schismatics who deserved enslavement. People living in areas with mixed populations were suspect. They might be crypto-pagans pretending to be Christian. With these flexible definitions, almost anyone could be declared non-Christian and therefore suitable for slavery. But the church went further than just allowing slavery. It actively participated in the slave trade. Monasteries were some of the largest slave owners in Europe. The Abbey of St. Denis near Paris owned over 400 slaves in 1250. The monastery at Cluny had 300. These weren't just domestic servants. They were agricultural workers, craftsmen, and manufacturers who generated huge profits for the religious communities. The church justified this by claiming that monastic slaves were better treated than those owned by secular masters. They received religious instruction, were protected from excessive abuse, and had their spiritual needs cared for. The reality was different. Monastic slaves worked just as hard as any others, lived in similar conditions, and had no more hope of freedom. The main difference was that their owners prayed for their souls while working them to death. Some monasteries specialized in training slaves for resale. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés had workshops where young slaves were taught valuable skills like metalworking, weaving, and manuscript copying. Trained slaves sold for much higher prices than untrained ones, generating significant revenue for the monastery. The church also provided financial services to the slave trade. Church banks, especially in Italy, offered loans to slave merchants, insurance for slave shipments, and currency exchange services for international slave sales. The Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar military religious orders were heavily involved in slave trading in the Eastern Mediterranean. They captured Muslims during crusades and sold them in European markets. They also bought Christian slaves from Muslim territories and either freed them if they could pay ransom or resold them if they couldn't. But the most hypocritical part was how the church handled enforcement of its own rules. When Christian merchants were caught enslaving other Christians, the penalties were usually minor. A fine, some penance, maybe a temporary ban from communion. Nothing that would seriously discourage the practice. When Christians were enslaved by Muslims or pagans, the church organized expensive ransom operations and called for crusades to free them. But when Christians enslaved other Christians, it was treated as a civil matter outside church jurisdiction. The church developed elaborate legal theories to justify this double standard. Christian slaves owned by Christian masters were servants rather than slaves. Christian captives held by pagans were martyrs for the faith. The same person in bondage could be a sinner deserving punishment or a saint deserving rescue, depending on who owned them. Bishops and archbishops regularly owned large numbers of slaves. Cardinal Pietro Colonna had over 200 slaves working his estates around Rome. Bishop Fulbert of Chartres owned 150. These weren't men who lived in poverty and self-denial. They were wealthy aristocrats whose lifestyles depended on slave labor. But they were also the same men who preached about Christian charity and the equality of all souls before God. The church's internal documents reveal the extent of this hypocrisy. Letters between bishops discuss slave purchases like they were buying livestock. Monastery account books list slaves alongside other property. Papal bulls authorize military orders to capture and sell non-Christian populations. One particularly disturbing document from 1290 is a letter from the Archbishop of Narbonne to a Genoese slave merchant. The Archbishop is complaining that a shipment of Saracen slaves he ordered hasn't arrived on schedule. He needs them to work his vineyards before the harvest season begins. A Christian archbishop, buying Muslim slaves for agricultural labor and treating it as a routine business transaction. The church also developed special ceremonies for slave transactions to give them religious legitimacy. There were blessings for new slave purchases, prayers for successful slave voyages, and thanksgiving services for profitable slave sales. Some churches had special chapels where slave dealers would pray for success in their ventures. The Church of San Giorgio degli Schiavoni in Venice, literally St. George of the Slavs, was funded by profits from Slavic slave trading and included religious artwork celebrating the capture and conversion of pagan slaves. The church even created patron saints for slave traders. St. Vincent Delaware Paul, who ministered to galley slaves, became a popular saint among merchants who owned slave-powered ships. They prayed to him for protection during slave voyages and gave thanks for successful sales. But the most disturbing part was how the church handled slave rebellions and escapes. When slaves fled from Christian masters, the church would refuse them sanctuary and often return them for punishment. When slaves revolted against Christian owners, the church would call it sinful disobedience and support violent suppression. But when Christian slaves escaped from Muslim masters, the church would celebrate their freedom as God's will and provide them with shelter and support. The same actions, escape and rebellion, were condemned or celebrated depending on who the slaves were running from. The church's role in medieval slavery shows how religious institutions can become corrupted by economic interests. The profits from slave trading were too large, and the social pressure to participate was too strong for the church to maintain its moral principles. Instead, it developed elaborate justifications that let church officials profit from slavery while maintaining their religious credentials. They created theological loopholes, legal exceptions, and ceremonial blessings that made human trafficking compatible with Christian faith. This pattern would repeat itself in later centuries. When European powers began the Atlantic slave trade, they used many of the same religious justifications developed by the medieval church. The idea that enslaving non-Christians was actually charitable because it exposed them to Christian teaching became a cornerstone of colonial slavery. The medieval church's compromise with slavery wasn't just historical hypocrisy. It created intellectual and moral frameworks that justified centuries of subsequent oppression. But let's get back to the slaves themselves. Because while church officials and wealthy merchants were debating the theological fine points of who could be enslaved, millions of actual human beings were living through the daily reality of bondage. And that reality was far more brutal than most people understand. Number 9. Life as a slave in medieval Europe. When people think about slavery, they usually picture plantations in America. But here's what most people don't realize. Medieval Europe had its own brutal system of slavery that lasted for centuries, and the life of a medieval slave was something that would shock you. Picture this: you wake up before dawn in a cold stone cellar. Your bed is nothing more than straw on the ground. You don't know what day it is because days don't matter when you're property. You don't belong to yourself. You belong to someone else, completely and totally. Medieval slaves worked in every corner of society. Slaves were employed in many activities, including agriculture, industry, the military, and domestic labor. But here's where it gets really dark. The type of work you did as a slave often determined whether you'd survive another year. Let me tell you about the different lives slaves lived, and trust me, some of these will make your skin crawl. Most slaves ended up working in agriculture. Think about working from sunrise to sunset in the fields, but you never get to eat the food you grow. You plant the seeds, you harvest the crops, but all of that food goes to your master's table while you survive on scraps. Agricultural slaves had some of the hardest physical work. Picture breaking your back in the hot sun, pulling weeds, harvesting grain with primitive tools. Your hands would be permanently stained with dirt and blood from cuts. During harvest season, you might work 16 hours a day, every single day, until the crops were in. But here's what made it even worse. You had no protection from the weather. When it rained, you worked in the rain. When it was freezing cold, you still worked outside. There were no sick days when you were property. I remember reading about one account from a medieval chronicle that described agricultural slaves as looking more like walking skeletons than human beings by the end of harvest season. That's how brutal this work was. And if you think that was bad, wait until you hear about the mines. Some of the worst working conditions were those in mines or quarries. Enslaved people were forced to work with no respite in deep, dark, and narrow tunnels. Being sent to work in the mines was basically a death sentence with extra steps. Imagine being forced deep underground into tunnels so narrow you can barely stand up straight. The air is thick with dust that makes you cough up blood. There's no natural light down there, just the flickering of a few oil lamps that barely let you see a few feet ahead. The work was both physically demanding and dangerous, with the tunnels risking collapse. You're swinging a pickaxe for 12 to 14 hours a day, breaking rocks and hauling heavy baskets over up steep tunnels. Your lungs are slowly filling with dust, and your body is breaking down bit by bit. Mining slaves had the shortest life expectancy of any slaves. Most didn't survive more than a few years in the mines. The ones who did survive often went blind from the darkness or developed terrible lung diseases from breathing all that dust. Here's something that really shows how brutal this was. Slaves could also end up in the mines as punishment, and even in the mines were subject to harsher discipline than the formerly free convicts. Think about that. Even criminals who had committed serious crimes were treated better than slaves in the mines. But not all slaves worked in fields or mines. Some had what might seem like better jobs, but don't be fooled. Late medieval slaves were predominantly women, and mostly worked in domestic settings. If you were a woman and you became a slave, you'd probably end up as a domestic servant in some noble's household. Now, this might sound easier than working in the mines, But domestic slavery came with its own special kind of hell. You lived in your master's house, but you were never safe. You were available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You cooked their food, cleaned their house, took care of their children, and did whatever else they demanded. Women were prioritized over men, and usually served in the domestic sphere as menials, concubines, criai, or wives. And here's where it gets really dark. Female domestic slaves were often used as concubines. They had no say in what happened to their own bodies. They could be forced into sexual relationships with their masters or anyone their master chose. Domestic slaves lived in constant fear. One wrong move, one moment of clumsiness, and they could be beaten or even killed. They watched their masters live in luxury while they slept on the floor and ate table scraps. Here's a story that really shows how brutal this could be. There's a record from medieval Italy about a domestic slave named Maria who accidentally broke her master's favorite cup. As punishment, her master had her fingers crushed with a hammer so she'd remember to be more careful. This wasn't unusual, this was just Tuesday for a medieval domestic slave. Now here's something that might surprise you. Many slaves were forced to become soldiers. Slaves were employed in many activities, including agriculture, industry. The military. Think about how twisted this is. You're enslaved by a society, then forced to fight and die to protect that same society. Military slaves were trained to fight, given weapons, and sent into battle. But they weren't fighting for freedom or glory. They were fighting because they had no choice. If they tried to run away, they'd be hunted down and killed. If they refused to fight, they'd be executed on the spot. These military slaves often found themselves in the most dangerous positions in battle. They were used as cannon fodder, sent in first to absorb the enemy's initial attack while the real soldiers stayed safer in the back. But here's what's really messed up. Some military slaves became very skilled warriors. A few even rose to positions of leadership. But no matter how good they became at fighting, they were still property. They could still be sold, beaten, or killed at any moment. Some slaves were forced into entertainment. They became jugglers, musicians, dancers, or actors for their master's amusement. This might sound like the best job for a slave, but think about what it really meant. You had to be on all the time. You had to smile and perform and make your masters laugh, even when you were starving or sick or heartbroken. If you weren't entertaining enough, you'd be punished or sent to do harder work. Many entertainment slaves were children who had been taken from their families. They were trained from a young age to sing, dance, or perform acrobatics. Their childhood was stolen from them and replaced with a life of performing for the people who owned them. But here's what made this even more cruel. Entertainment slaves often lived in better conditions than other slaves. They might get better food and nicer clothes because their masters wanted them to look good while performing. This created a twisted situation where the slaves themselves sometimes felt grateful to their masters, even though they were still property. Actual slaves, such as the Kolops in Russia, could, by contrast, be treated like regular slaves, abused with no rights over their own bodies, could not leave the land they were bound to, and marry only with their lord's permission. No matter what type of work they did, all medieval slaves shared the same horrible reality. They had absolutely no rights. Zero. They couldn't own property, they couldn't get married without permission, they couldn't travel freely, and they couldn't even control what happened to their own bodies. If a slave was injured or became sick, their master might choose to heal them or might choose to let them die, depending on what was more profitable. Slaves couldn't seek help from authorities because the authorities didn't see them as human beings, they saw them as property. Here's something that really drives this home. There are records of slaves being sold along with livestock in the same transactions. A medieval bill of sale might list 2 cows, 1 pig, 3 chickens, and 1 slave girl, all in the same document. They were literally treated like animals. And if you're thinking, well, at least they had each other for support, think again. Slave families were routinely separated. Children were sold away from their parents, husbands separated from wives. Masters did this on purpose because slaves who were isolated and alone were easier to control. But the physical abuse was just part of the horror. The psychological torture was just as bad, maybe worse. Imagine knowing that you will never be free. That your children will be born into slavery. That no matter how hard you work or how good you are, you will always be someone else's property. Many slaves developed what we now recognize as severe depression and trauma. They lived in constant fear, never knowing when they might be beaten, sold, or killed. Some slaves tried to take their own lives rather than continue living as property. The daily hardship of serfs plowing fields, herding livestock, and performing menial tasks mirrored many conditions that a medieval slave might endure, but slaves had it even worse than serfs, because serfs at least had some legal protections. There are accounts of slaves who had been free people before being enslaved, and their writings describe the complete psychological breakdown that came with losing their humanity. One former merchant who became a slave wrote about forgetting what it felt like to make his own decisions, to go where he wanted, or even to speak without permission. The life expectancy of medieval slaves varied depending on their work, but was always much shorter than free people. Agricultural slaves might live into their 40s if they were lucky. Mining slaves rarely made it past 30. Domestic slaves often lived longer, but they faced constant abuse and sexual violence. Child slaves had it the worst. Many died before reaching adulthood from overwork, disease, or abuse. Those who survived to become adult slaves were already broken physically and psychologically from years of trauma. What's really heartbreaking is that many slaves never lived to see their children grow up. Parents would be sold away from their families, or they died from overwork while their children were still young. This meant that slave children often had no one to protect them or teach them about life before slavery. Some slaves did try to escape, though it was incredibly dangerous. If you were caught trying to run away, the punishment was usually death, often by very brutal methods designed to scare other slaves from trying the same thing. The few slaves who did manage to escape faced a nearly impossible situation. They had no money, no connections, and no legal identity. They couldn't go back to their homeland because they might be recaptured and sold again. They couldn't easily blend into free society because slaves were often marked with brands or had obvious signs of their former bondage. Most escaped slaves tried to hide in forests or remote areas, living like wild animals rather than risk being caught and returned to slavery. Very few managed to build new lives as free people. But here's what's really messed up. Sometimes slaves were freed by their masters, but this often came with conditions that kept them tied to their former owner. They might be freed, but required to continue working for their former master for a certain number of years, or they might be freed but left with no resources to actually start a new life. The thing that made medieval slavery so effective and so horrific was how completely it stripped away people's humanity. From the moment someone became a slave, society stopped seeing them as a person. They were given new names by their masters, usually simple, degrading names that had nothing to do with their original identity. They were forced to dress in ways that marked them as slaves. In many places, slaves had to wear special collars or brands that identified them as property. Slaves weren't allowed to practice their own religion, speak their native language, or maintain any connection to their former life. The goal was to completely erase who they had been before and turn them into obedient property. This dehumanization wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. It made it easier for free people to justify the system. If slaves weren't really people in the same way that free people were, then treating them like property didn't feel morally wrong. One of the most horrific aspects of medieval slavery was that it was often hereditary. If your mother was a slave, you were born a slave. You inherited not just the legal status of slavery, but also all the trauma, abuse, and dehumanization that came with it. Children born into slavery often never knew what freedom felt like. They grew up thinking that being owned by another person was normal. This psychological conditioning made them easier to control, but it also meant that generations of people lived and died without ever experiencing basic human dignity. These children learned to survive by being completely obedient, by never questioning authority, and by accepting whatever treatment they received. This created a cycle of trauma that lasted for centuries, with each generation of slaves passing their survival strategies and their psychological wounds to the next. Now, you might be wondering, how did this massive system of human misery finally come to an end? And what kind of impact did centuries of medieval slavery have on the world we live in today? That's where our story gets even more complicated, because the end of medieval slavery wasn't really an end at all, it was just the beginning of something even bigger and more devastating. The legacy of these medieval slave markets and the systems they created would go on to shape the entire modern world in ways that most people have never even thought about. The trading routes, the economic systems, the racial ideologies, even the way we think about human rights today, all of it traces back to what happened in those medieval marketplaces where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Number 10, the long shadow of medieval slavery. So you thought medieval slavery was just some ancient horror that stayed buried in the past? Think again. The slave markets of medieval Europe didn't just disappear. They evolved, expanded, and created the blueprint for something far more massive and devastating than anything the medieval world had ever seen. Here's what most history books won't tell you clearly. The techniques, the trade routes, the legal systems, and even the racist ideologies that justified the Atlantic slave trade didn't just appear out of nowhere in the 1400s and 1500s. They grew directly out of the medieval slave markets we've been talking about. The connections are so direct and so obvious once you see them, you'll wonder how anyone could miss it. When people learn about the Atlantic slave trade, they often think of it as this completely new thing that started when Europeans began exploring Africa and the Americas. But that's not what happened at all. The Atlantic slave trade was essentially medieval European slavery going global. Think about it like this: medieval slave traders had been perfecting their craft for centuries. They knew how to capture people, how to transport them, how to break them psychologically, and how to sell them for maximum profit. They had established trading networks, legal frameworks, and social justifications for treating humans as property. When European explorers started venturing further from home, they didn't invent slavery. They just scaled up what they already knew how to do. The same Italian merchants who had been trading slaves in the Mediterranean for centuries were the ones who financed the early Atlantic expeditions. The same legal concepts that allowed medieval Europeans to own other humans were expanded to justify enslaving Africans and Native Americans. Even the physical infrastructure was connected. Some of the ports that had been centers of medieval slave trading, places like Venice, Genoa, and Seville, became the launching points for Atlantic slave expeditions. Medieval slave traders had developed sophisticated techniques for every aspect of the slave trade that would later be used on a much larger scale. They knew how to design ships for transporting human cargo, how to pack people into the smallest possible space while keeping enough of them alive to make the voyage profitable. The horrible design of Atlantic slave ships wasn't new. It was based on centuries of experience transporting slaves across the Mediterranean and other European waters. They had perfected methods for breaking people psychologically. The techniques used to turn proud, free people into obedient slaves had been refined over hundreds of years. Separate families to break emotional bonds. Use extreme violence against a few to terrorize the rest. Give some slaves slightly better treatment to create division and prevent unified resistance. Medieval slave traders had even worked out the economics. They knew which types of people were most valuable in different markets, how to price human beings for maximum profit, and how to finance large-scale slave trading operations. All of this expertise didn't disappear when medieval slave markets closed. It got exported to the New World and applied on a scale that medieval Europeans could never have imagined. The trading routes that connected medieval slave markets became the foundation for much larger networks. Let me show you how this worked. Medieval slave traders had established connections between Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. They had networks that reached into Africa through North African trading partners. They had systems for moving people from Northern Europe down to southern markets. When European exploration expanded these networks to include the Americas, they didn't start from scratch. They extended existing relationships and trading partnerships. For example, the same Arab and North African merchants who had been supplying slaves to medieval European markets became intermediaries in the Atlantic slave trade. The same techniques for raiding and capturing people that had been used in Eastern Europe were applied to West and Central Africa. Even the financing systems were connected. Italian banking families who had made fortunes from medieval slave trading invested their profits in Atlantic slave ventures. The wealth accumulated from centuries of medieval slavery provided the capital that funded the much larger Atlantic trade. This is where it gets really important to understand the connection. The legal systems that allowed medieval slavery didn't just disappear. They were adapted and expanded to justify enslaving millions of people from Africa and the Americas. Medieval European law had already worked out most of the legal problems of owning human beings. How do you define someone as property? How do you transfer ownership? How do you handle disputes over slave ownership? What legal protections, if any, should slaves have? All of these questions have been answered by medieval legal scholars and courts. When European colonies in the Americas needed legal frameworks for slavery, they didn't have to invent new laws. They just modified existing medieval legal concepts. The idea that some people were naturally suited for slavery had been part of European thinking for centuries. Medieval scholars had argued that certain groups of people, pagans, prisoners of war, people from certain regions could be legitimately enslaved because they were somehow less than fully human. This intellectual framework was easily adapted to justify enslaving Africans and Native Americans. The same basic arguments that medieval Europeans had used to enslave each other were simply expanded to include people from other continents. Now, here's where the story gets really dark, and it's something that connects medieval slavery directly to modern racism. Medieval slavery wasn't initially based on race the way later slavery was. Medieval Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Arabs enslaved Europeans and Africans, and so on. Slavery was more about power, religion, and opportunity than about race. But as medieval slave trading evolved, European merchants began to notice patterns in their markets. They found that certain physical characteristics, skin color, facial features, hair texture, made it easier to identify and control slaves. A person with obviously different physical features couldn't easily blend into the free population and escape. They were permanently marked as foreign, and therefore potentially enslaved. European slave traders began to prefer slaves who looked obviously different from the local free population. This was purely practical at first. Different-looking slaves were easier to control. But over time, this practical preference turned into ideological racism. European thinkers began to argue that people who looked different were naturally inferior, and therefore naturally suited for slavery. By the time Europeans began large-scale slave trading in Africa and the Americas, they already had several centuries of experience associating physical differences with slave status. The racism that justified the Atlantic slave trade wasn't created in the Americas. It evolved out of medieval European slavery practices. The economic impact of medieval slavery created the foundation for much larger economic systems based on enslaved labor. Medieval European economies had become dependent on slave labor in certain sectors. Agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and domestic service all relied heavily on slaves in many parts of Europe. This created what economists call path dependency. Once an economy becomes dependent on a particular type of labor, it becomes very hard to change. The profits from slave labor were reinvested in ways that made the economy even more dependent on slavery. When European colonization opened up new territories, colonial economies were designed around the same slave-dependent model that had worked in medieval Europe. The plantation system in the Americas wasn't a new invention. It was an expansion of agricultural systems that had been developed using slave labor in medieval Europe. The financial instruments used to fund slave trading, partnerships, insurance, credit systems had all been developed in medieval European slave markets. When Atlantic slave trading required much larger amounts of capital, merchants just scaled up financial techniques they already knew. Even the consumer demand for slave-produced goods had been created by medieval slavery. Europeans had become accustomed to cheap sugar, luxury textiles, and other goods produced by slave labor. When colonial slavery made these goods even cheaper and more available, there was already a market ready to consume them. But the economic and legal connections are just part of the story. Medieval slavery also created cultural attitudes and psychological patterns that made later, larger-scale slavery possible. Centuries of slavery had normalized the idea that some people could own other people. European society had adapted to the presence of slaves. Free Europeans had learned to see slaves as a different category of human being, not quite animals, but not quite people either. This psychological adaptation was crucial for what came later. When Europeans began enslaving millions of Africans and Native Americans, they already had mental frameworks for justifying and managing mass human enslavement. The dehumanization techniques that had been developed in medieval slavery, the special names, the degrading clothing, the systematic stripping away of identity, were applied on a much larger scale in colonial slavery. The methods of psychological control that had been perfected over centuries of medieval slavery became the foundation for managing much larger slave populations in the Americas. Even the resistance patterns were connected. Slave rebellions in medieval Europe had taught slave owners how to prevent and suppress resistance. These same techniques were used to control slave populations in the colonies. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval slavery didn't just influence what Europeans did in other parts of the world. It fundamentally changed European society itself in ways that shaped everything that came after. The wealth from centuries of slave trading helped finance the exploration and colonization that made Europeans globally dominant. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa used profits from slave trading to become major maritime powers. Spanish and Portuguese slave traders used their expertise and capital to launch colonial empires. The technical knowledge gained from medieval slavery, shipbuilding, navigation, colonial administration, military tactics, became the foundation of European global expansion. Medieval slavery had also created a mindset among Europeans that they were naturally superior to other peoples and therefore had the right to dominate them. This psychological foundation was essential for the mindset that justified European colonization and cultural imperialism. The social hierarchies that had been created by medieval slavery, the idea that some people were naturally suited to rule while others were naturally suited to serve, became part of European thinking about their relationship with the rest of the world. The economic effects of medieval slavery continued to compound over centuries. The wealth accumulated from medieval slave trading provided the capital for colonial ventures, which generated even more wealth, which funded further expansion. By the time the Atlantic slave trade was in full swing, European merchants had centuries of accumulated capital from slave trading to invest. This gave them enormous advantages over potential competitors from other parts of the world. The trading networks established through medieval slavery became the foundation for global commerce. Cities that had been centers of medieval slave trading became centers of global trade. The routes used to transport medieval slaves became major commercial shipping lanes. Even today, some of the wealthiest European families and institutions could trace their fortunes back to medieval slave trading. Banks, trading companies, and noble families that profited from medieval slavery used those profits to invest in other ventures that continued to generate wealth for centuries. Perhaps the most important long-term impact of medieval slavery was ideological. The ideas and attitudes that justified medieval slavery became the foundation for much more elaborate systems of justification for later oppression. The concept of racial hierarchy that justified centuries of oppression was built on foundations laid by medieval slavery. The idea that some groups of people were naturally inferior and could therefore be legitimately dominated by others didn't start with colonial slavery. It evolved out of medieval European attitudes toward their own slaves. The notion that economic development required the exploitation of certain groups of people became deeply embedded in European thinking. When Europeans colonized other parts of the world, they assumed that development meant establishing systems of dominance similar to what had worked in medieval Europe. The legal and intellectual frameworks that allowed humans to be treated as property became so deeply embedded in European culture that it took centuries to fully challenge them. Even today, many of the concepts and assumptions that grew out of medieval slavery continue to influence how we think about economics, politics, and human rights. The legacy of medieval slavery also includes the legacy of resistance. People who were enslaved in medieval Europe developed strategies for survival and resistance that were passed down and adapted by later generations of enslaved people. The underground networks that helped medieval slaves escape became models for the Underground Railroad and similar resistance movements. The cultural practices that slaves used to maintain their identity and dignity despite dehumanizing conditions became the foundation for later liberation movements. Even the songs, stories, and spiritual practices that sustain enslaved people through centuries of oppression can be traced back to techniques developed during medieval slavery. The legal and political strategies used by medieval slaves and their allies to challenge the slave system became part of a longer tradition of resistance that eventually led to abolition movements. Now, here's where this gets really contemporary and really important. The systems and attitudes created by medieval slavery didn't end when legal slavery was abolished. They evolved into other forms of oppression and exploitation that continue today. The economic systems that were built on slave labor became the foundation for industrial capitalism. The wealth accumulated from centuries of slave labor became the capital that funded industrialization. The techniques used to control and exploit slave labor became the basis for industrial labor relations. The racial hierarchies that justified medieval and colonial slavery evolved into modern racism. The legal systems that defined humans as property became the foundation for legal systems that continue to treat some people as less deserving of rights and protections than others. The geographic patterns of wealth and poverty that were established by slave trading continue to shape global economics today. Regions that were sources of slaves remained economically disadvantaged, while regions that profited from slave trading remained centers of global wealth and power. Even the psychological and cultural patterns created by centuries of slavery continue to influence how we think about work, authority, and social relationships. The idea that some people are naturally suited to serve others, the assumption that economic growth requires exploitation, The notion that violence is an acceptable way to maintain social order. All of these attitudes have roots in the slave systems of medieval Europe. Perhaps most importantly, medieval slavery created what we might call a hidden curriculum about human relationships that was passed down through generations and continues to influence behavior today. Children who grew up in societies where slavery was normal learned lessons about power, dominance, and human value that they passed on to their own children. Even families who never owned slaves were influenced by living in societies where some humans were treated as property. These lessons became so deeply embedded in European culture that they influenced everything: family relationships, education systems, religious beliefs, political structures, economic theories, even art and literature. When Europeans spread across the globe through colonization, they brought these deeply embedded attitudes with them. Societies that had never practiced slavery found themselves subjected to people whose entire worldview had been shaped by centuries of treating humans as property. The legal abolition of slavery in the 1800s and early 1900s was a huge moral and political victory, but didn't undo the deeper structural and psychological legacy of medieval slavery. The economic systems that had been built on slave labor were modified but not fundamentally changed. The racial hierarchies that had justified slavery were challenged but not eliminated. The cultural attitudes that had made slavery seem normal were questioned but not fully transformed. In many ways, we're still living with the consequences of medieval slavery. The global economic system still reflects patterns established by slave trading centuries ago. Political power is still concentrated in regions that profited from historical slavery. Cultural attitudes about race, class, and human value still show the influence of ideologies that were developed to justify enslaving other humans. This is why understanding medieval slavery is so important for understanding the modern world. It's not just ancient history, it's the foundation of current reality. When we look at global patterns of wealth and poverty, we're seeing the long-term consequences of economic systems built on slave labor. When we examine racial discrimination and inequality, we're seeing the evolution of ideologies that were originally developed to justify medieval slavery. When we try to understand why certain forms of exploitation and oppression seem so persistent and difficult to eliminate, part of the answer lies in understanding how deeply these patterns were embedded in European culture through centuries of slavery. The slave markets of medieval Europe weren't just places where individual people were bought and sold. They were laboratories where Europeans developed techniques, attitudes, and systems that would go on to shape the entire modern world. The merchants who learned to see humans as commodities became the ancestors of economic systems that still treat human labor as just another factor of production. The legal scholars who developed frameworks for owning people became the intellectual ancestors of legal systems that continue to privilege property rights over human rights. The theologians and philosophers who created moral justifications for slavery became the intellectual ancestors of ideologies that continue to justify inequality and oppression. And perhaps most importantly, the millions of people who learned to see slavery as normal, who adapted to living in societies where humans could be owned, became the cultural ancestors of societies that still struggle to fully recognize the equal humanity and dignity of all people. The long shadow of medieval slavery reaches into every corner of the modern world. Understanding that shadow, seeing how it continues to shape economics, politics, culture, and individual psychology is essential for anyone who wants to understand how we got to where we are today and what we need to do to build a more just and humane world. The story of medieval slavery isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and changing the future. The techniques of dehumanization that were perfected in medieval slave markets are still being used today. The economic systems that were built on slave labor continue to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of those whose ancestors profited from human trafficking. But understanding this history also reveals something hopeful. If these systems were created by human decisions over centuries, they can also be changed by human decisions. The same creativity and determination that built systems of oppression can be redirected toward building systems of justice and equality. The medieval slave markets are gone, but their legacy lives on. The question for us is what we're going to do with that knowledge.